Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. This is one of these insight calls that we started doing 3, 4 years ago at when it was still called Venture ESG, now Reframe Venture, to bring some of the thinking that we have in our ecosystem from the LPs to the GPs to the academics to the wider world. We do a lot of these calls that are invite only for our VCs and for our LPs, sometimes with professors like Rob and Gopal here, sometimes just among ourselves, but once a quarter, we want to lift one of these questions that we've been seeing coming up over and over again into the wider ecosystem. So welcome everyone who doesn't normally see us, engage with us. I've heard yesterday that this is the most philosophical question we've ever asked. As it happens, we have at least one philosopher on this call. I think it's not philosophical at all, which is why we also have two VCs on the call. We're trying to get to the bottom of a fast approach to what is likely going to drive the next wave of AI investment, is already driving the next wave of AI investments. 50% of venture capital in the last 12 months was in what the VCs themselves would describe as AI. As I think we're also going to get into in a second, is all of that AI is a whole question in of itself, but lots of that was still driven by the mega rounds for the Anthropics, OpenAIs, and chips of this world. That is very fast changing. We'll hear in a second what is happening in the VC world on this agentic AI, so perhaps the next frontier after the LLMs. And I'm very, very happy that we have 4 fantastic panelists to discuss this with today. First, Dama Sathianathan, partner at Bethnal Ventures, one of our steering committee funds here in London. Representing both and perhaps impact angle onto a lot of this, good AI and an early stage investor angle here out of the UK. Rob Reich, McGregor-Girard Professor of Social Ethics of Science and Technology at Stanford, who I've actually just seen in person for our Stanford Summit, where we discussed not specifically the agentic AI piece, but lots around responsible AI. Professor Gopal Ramchurn, Professor of AI at University of Southampton, and perhaps as important for this particular call, the CEO of Responsible AI UK, another expert voice to drive us forward, both with what even are we talking about and what is best practice in this space. And then Paul Murphy, partner at Lightspeed Venture Partners, bringing in, even though you're also based in London, Paul, perhaps a kind of global American big venture firm view into this, what's happening in your portfolios right now. We kicked this off with a conversation among us, but please, audience, I'm going to try my best. If you have questions along our conversation, things you don't understand or things where you want to go deeper, drop them in a chat. We'll see how we turn out with our 9-minute answers from the panelists at the end for Q&A, but I will do my absolute best to build in the Q&As that you already have throughout the conversation. But before we go any further, Gopal, Rob, looking at you two, what is agentic AI? I've said earlier, if we don't share a definition, we get very quickly into territory where we all swim and we disagree on stuff, even though we're actually not talking about the same thing. So perhaps, Gopal, explain in simple terms what we mean when we say agent AI, agentic AI, AI agents, including perhaps a little bit about how these things are built, what they're based on. And then we go a little bit more concretely into what does that mean for the startups. But Gopal, Rob, take it away.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Johannes, for this intro. Just to add, I'm not just a CEO of Responsible AI. I also have a couple of startups where I'm exploiting AI and agent-based systems out there in the real world. And so agents, the concept of agents, agent-based computing, software agents has been around for more than 25 years, 28 years. And but a specific meaning assigned to the notion of agents in the last couple of years with the advances with LLMs. And agents tend to refer to pieces of software that can be given goals and act on those goals. So they construct a number of steps by themselves to execute on this goal. And they recognize the environment that they are in. They understand the implications of what they do to this environment, and then can optimize their behaviors in reaction to what happens in this environment. So that environment may include other agents and humans. So they could be communicating with other agents, they could be communicating with humans. And basically embed this notion of reactiveness, being able to react to external conditions, and proactiveness. So they're really understanding what they could do to optimize the success of their actions in a number of steps. In the last sort of the old versions of AI, when we didn't have LLMs, the models used by these that you would embed, the mathematical models that you would construct into the software, would be tailored to a particular domain. So you would tailor, for example, a mathematical model to understand an environment where a UAV, a drone is flying, and it would optimize its behavior to avoid obstacles or to survey an environment. But now with LLMs, we can allow these agents to adapt their behaviors to any kind of context, and they recognize the goal that they're given. They figure out that the goal is relevant to that particular problem. For example, booking a flight ticket, or booking a hotel in a particular country, or defining a set of steps to arrange your holidays or your meetings, and they can execute that. But there are questions around their reliability, and that's why we're having this conversation today.
Maybe I'll just offer, after that wonderful explanation, a simple metaphor that works for me in thinking about the distinctiveness of AI agents and their deployment. Think about the difference between having a calculator or a spreadsheet software that will do a whole bunch of things for you, and the difference between hiring a financial analyst who will have a whole range of things to do. Previous AI, non-agentic AI, is the calculator or the spreadsheet. Agentic AI is the financial analyst now in a piece of software, as Gopal said, navigating the general environment, but within certain assumed bounds. If you wanted to put it in a sort of philosophical definition, at least for me, agentic AI is autonomous agency for the piece of software with some bounded authority. And part of the task for us in designing the environment in which agents will behave reliably is to ensure that agents can interact not only with the web, but with each other online in some fashion, as well as trusting that the delegations we give to the agents are indeed honored by the agent, and they don't go rogue, as it were.
And before we go deeper into the issues and the responsibility or perhaps irresponsibility of those, Dama, Paul, examples from either your portfolio, your pipelines, what you're seeing in the market, concrete as possible. What does that look like? What are people building right now? What are the entrepreneurs making of this professorial way of defining an agent? And perhaps Dama to start and Paul to come in.
Yeah, I think from the sort of perspective, what we see at the early stages, and when I say early, I mean really, really early, sort of pre-seed, pre-product, pre-revenue oftentimes. I think quite a lot of it is we now see the sort of proliferation of companion apps, particularly where it's built on either open source models or on large language models that are openly available. Going into spaces that have traditionally been sort of human to human relationships, and quite sensitive spaces as well. So a lot of mental health care, a lot of legal services and legal advice, all with complexities of the problems that could arise from those as well. And we can definitely go into the issues around these particular complexities later on as well. But that's definitely the sort of crux of what we see in the market at the moment in terms of people building particular services using AI powered and AI enabled, or whatever form of AI that is possible at that stage, to basically fix particular issues where traditional or historically services have not been met, which is an exciting turn, because that now also seems to address quite significant problems from an impact perspective, and for an impact fund that's actually serving needs, not particular wants, which is very exciting. But again, there are sort of examples that have emerged, particularly in the sort of companion space around sort of mental health care provision, that have deeply exposed some of the problems that arise when people are given bad advice that is not clinically validated. As well as sort of, yeah, there's so many tech for bad examples that I can mention right now. I think if I may give a portfolio example, so we've invested in a company called Skin Analytics back in 2015 when AI wasn't even on the map. In mainstream VC, so quite traditional VCs have traditionally always been investing in AI when it wasn't necessarily called AI. But it's been quite interesting to sort of see the scope of what's possible because Skin Analytics is particularly around sort of derm assessment, so based on dermoscopic imaging, which doesn't take into account demographic factors, but is particularly focused on the provision of actually detecting lesions for skin cancer with underrepresented communities as well, where historically training data hasn't existed or where a lack of trust within the existing systems has also existed and led to quite different pathways in the healthcare provision as well. And that's one of the sort of early examples of where we see the sort of clinical guidance actually really being taken into account and different emphasis on a standard of evidence on how rigorous your impact measurement and management practices can be from the early stages onwards up to sort of the point where they're at, which is Series B, is incredibly important as well. And it does sort of address more issues than just the tech layer because we talk about the ethical iceberg quite a lot, which sort of goes, if you think about the iceberg, and the tip of the iceberg is usually the technology layer that people really focus on at the early stages, but the culture, the business models, the legal structures, all the other aspects of the business that really come to determine what scale can be and what ambition the founders bring into the products and services as well is incredibly important for what is responsible AI as well.
Paul, to come in before we go one level deeper into the responsibility, because I think that's the crux of the question, right? If we don't agree on responsibility as the term to assess with, Paul, give us an example or two or three. What is an agent in your world?
So I think the examples and the definitions have been really helpful so far. I mean, in an even simpler way, kind of how I look at it is traditional software are basically tools to help you get jobs done, and agents do the jobs. So it's sort of taking it a few steps further. I think most of the examples that we're all familiar with, or certainly were early days of AI becoming more popular, were the customer service agents. Klarna and a number of airlines. I mean, I think there was a famous Air Canada chatbot that invented policies that didn't exist, and the airline was liable to sort of uphold them. And so there's those examples. I think what we're seeing today is less of that from an investment perspective. To give a concrete example, we just backed a company that is basically it's an agentic performance marketing solution. So the performance marketing, for those that don't know, is actually it's been traditionally a manual process, running thousands of campaigns at the same time, looking for small differences and optimizing those differences. And then you just think of infinite variables. And getting that right can be make or break for a business. So there's a lot of agencies that do that work today. This company is going out and building an agent to automate that work for those agencies. So the agencies still have a job and a role to play. But the kind of running thousands of campaigns at the same time, that can be done by the agent actually really effectively. So that's one example. And another example which I would point to is Mistral, one of our companies that I'm on the board of. They're built their own agents to actually help with their own deployment of the Mistral AI solution into the enterprise, whereas otherwise that would have required large teams of engineers.
Air Canada chatbots inventing policies, mental health issues with AI companions. That's very easy, perhaps, as a way into thinking about how AI agents can go wrong. What is irresponsible AI? Perhaps let's go back and very happily also go to one level more abstraction. If we want to answer the question, can AI agents be responsible, and if so, how, right? That's what we'll get to in a second. What is AI, responsible AI, secure AI, safe AI, trustworthy AI? There's a variety of ways of how people describe this. What does this mean? And what can we work with here? Perhaps starting with Rob and then Gopal again.
Great. Well, here's the philosophical perspective from the 35,000 foot level, and I'll give a couple concrete examples of how I think this frame I'm about to offer might be a helpful lens to think about this issue. I worked for the past year in the Biden-Harris administration in the United States at the newly created U.S. AI Safety Institute. And prior to that, I'd been doing a bunch of work here in Silicon Valley, chiefly at Stanford, on various issues of AI safety and security. And what I came to over the course of the past couple of years is the idea that the various labels that we get often get attached to things maybe under the umbrella of responsible AI sometimes can lead us astray. So, for example, I myself don't like to say that I work on AI safety because that is an implicit contrast with what gets called AI ethics. AI ethics is oriented towards the short time horizon, already existing harms of AI systems, say the easy availability of producing child pornography with image models or various forms of bias or discrimination in algorithmic decision making, whereas AI safety is something about longer time horizon, potentially catastrophic risks, even existential risks to humanity, national security sensitive risks. And these two camps, people who work on AI safety and AI ethics, are often at a bit of a war with each other in a way that then makes the broader space of responsible AI frustrating to find a unifying camp. Similarly, some people say they work on AI policy or AI law or AI regulation, and that's a fine domain in which to work. But I think it leaves out all of the necessary work that has to come from within the particular profession, the standards and the norms and the tooling that have to emerge from within the AI ML developer community. And if you focus only on law, policy, and regulation, your focus is on government necessarily. So as a result, the preferred term for me is AI governance. And what I would want to do is to talk about the combination of law, policy, and regulation alongside of the professional responsibilities for standards and norms and tooling in order to try to pioneer a path forward for what we can call then responsible AI. Let me give you a concrete illustration back to the agents issue. One of the things that's going to be important to work out is how it is that agents, if they're now not just merely working inside some corporate domain, the example that Paul gave of Mistral, but rather they're out in the wild, as it were, shopping for us, where we've delegated them to them to do something on our behalf. Well, how do we do identity verification? How do we know that the agent is able to represent itself as tied to us, the human being, as opposed to taking on any different number of identities, or perhaps not being able to be identified as a piece of software as opposed to a human when we're shopping online? Identity verification is going to be essential to working out the future here. To say what I think is obvious, policymakers could pass laws that require AI agents to do identity verification, but they're not going to write the software standard that creates that. That will have to come from within the respective professional community. Now, this particular thing is in the self-interest of any company that wants to deploy AI agents, so this, I think, will emerge naturally, but it's still a live question in many respects. All right, last thought here is that when we think of professional norms and standards and tooling, our direction, our gaze can come upon, in the case of this community, the founders and the companies that are being funded, and am trying to insist that they develop things with an eye toward a responsible development and deployment of these powerful technologies, and thinking in particular about the standards and the tooling that is necessary to design and develop in order for the ecosystem as a whole to go well rather than potentially poorly. The AI companion or therapy space is so fraught right now. There should be an interest in all of us to try to develop, not merely from the legal standpoint, But from the professional standpoint of AI ML developers in this space, to avoid the character AI kind of miseries and harms that have grown out of the particular rapid deployment of chatbot models for companionship that have not gone especially well in many cases. Over to you, Gopal.
A very broad and a really interesting take on AI governance. I'll maybe focus more on the technical elements. And I think having run a big program on trustworthy autonomous systems prior to the program I'm running, and just this week we've had 4 conversations on responsible agentic systems. How do we build greater responsibility in this? And there's a lot of funding going to research in this space. In the EU, in the US, there's a whole work stream at NIST looking at evaluating agentic AI systems, because there are concerns and sometimes misplaced concerns. So when we think about agentic AI, and I think distinguish it from some of the issues around bias in classifiers, there's this notion of agency, this notion of autonomy. These things can make decisions potentially without us, and then you have different grades of autonomy. So where they ask for permission from the human, or they take action and then let the human know. And at the end of the day, what we're really worried about is who's liable for the decision made by these agents, right? And sometimes I get asked the question, how do we build agents that we can trust? My problem right now is not that we build agents that we can trust. We actually overtrust so many of these agents as they are. People ask for health advice, ask for legal advice, financial advice from all these LLMs right now, and trust the advice that they get. And we've done studies on this to show that people trust these more than they trust humans sometimes. So we have a problem of overtrust or miscalibrated trust in many of these systems. And this blows up when something goes wrong. Someone dies, someone commits suicide, someone loses a lot of money, or a big scam blows up and everyone hears about it. And in many cases, it's because when we design these systems, we've just focused on the technical elements, not the socio-technical elements of these agentic AI systems. These systems do not exist in isolation of humans and other systems that they need to operate with, right? So you need to look at the system and see what are the potential failure modes of these systems and the workflows within which they are embedded. So many of the systems I'm coming across now look at how agentic AI will be embedded in workflows in complex organizations, and take on data from here, manipulate it, give it back to a human. The human gives back something, and then goes on and on. And that applies in the defense setup, in financial services, et cetera, et cetera. What we tend to forget is that when we build many of these agentic AI systems, we're asking the agent to come up with its own set of steps. We're trusting it to come up with these steps by itself, and trust it to know what steps to take. And very rarely do we question these steps. And one key point I like to highlight here is that when we see when many of these agentic AI systems will construct these next steps and never realize that they may not be able to take that step. Never tell the human, I can't do this. Can you please do that for me? Or I'm not allowed to do this. I think that's an important step in executing that, in achieving this goal. So you need to help me with this. Or there are risks associated with taking these sets of steps. And that's an irresponsible agent, right? If an agent is pushing out, as in the Air Canada case, pushing out something that is not checked with a human, is not sure. And very often this happens because the models of uncertainty, they've not modeled uncertainty, or they're not taken into account the levels of uncertainty in the outputs, or not quite realizing at the design phase that these are high-risk decisions that are being made by these agentic AI systems, and we should control this. We should really have a policy around some of these critical decisions, and where they can impact on people's financial security or health, or mental health. So a responsible agent cannot be just designed without thinking about the humans. And you see a bit of that coming across in the latest contextual evals that OpenAI just pushed out. You're starting to think about these situations in which there's highly context-specific settings where agents will be deployed rather than generic evals. So just passing the bar exam or passing the whatever other benchmark. They're thinking about contextual evals. And again, the question there is whether these contextual evals meet some kind of scientific rigor. Can we actually, if you're going to build this into safety critical systems, or do they meet certain really, really rigorous standards? And very often what we find is that the tests being designed are also designed by AI that is not perfectly reliable. So you design the data set, the test set, and very often the test data is already internalized into the LLM. So you're not really testing against an unseen data set. It has already been trained on that data set. So you need to be very careful with the testing regime. And that is why NIST, European Trustworthy Association, LNE in France, NPL in the UK, are all working on defining new criteria, or the right metrics to use when you evaluate agentic AI in specific sectors, specific use cases. They will have to go down to the specific use cases, but also trying to find generalized rules around defining what's acceptable or not at a technical level. But I don't think you can only do that at technical level. You also need to look at the qualitative elements, the human elements, and who you're putting that tool.
Maybe just to add on this, because I found this discussion hugely fascinating, but I do also wonder when it comes to the sort of terminology of saying, is it responsible AI? And there's always the notion of wanting to figuring out where the responsibility lies, whether it lies with the platforms or with the individual. Because traditionally, when we sort of look at the social media and the emergence of the different platforms that came, there's an argument to be made that a lot of times those platforms have always offloaded the risk onto the individual, particularly when it came to redress. Whereas we see now the sort of complexity of trying to figure out whose responsibility is it now if something bad happens, with different governments and different institutions mandating their own interpretations of the law, where there's also, it sort of begs the question whether the current legal landscape is mature enough or equipped even to provide assurance as to what needs to happen when shit goes down. I think Replica is a really good example, because the AI companion Replica was temporarily banned by the Italian Data Protection Authority for the violations of GDPR, predominantly, but also because of the risk to minors and vulnerable individuals. And that sort of set a precedent to also other European countries predominantly to sort of consider what the legal risk might be for particularly minors and teenagers as well, who were possibly the sort of power users of those apps as well, which is another sort of distortion, because there seems to be a bit of a generational shift in trying to understand how pervasive some of those products and services have become embedded into the lives of younger people as well, which is an intrinsic sort of question. So it does beg the question, where do we see that responsibility lies? And particularly for us as sort of minority shareholders in companies, we always struggle with sort of that notion as well, and what's within our best interest and what's within our power as sort of shareholders as well, in terms of what we can do. But absolutely also understanding that we are at the early stages of investing, and sort of see the sort of trajectory of some of the companies going through the later stages as well, and seeing the sort of shift in what might happen.
If I can just add to that, I think, Dama, your example there of inviting us to think about liability and responsibility is really good. So for anyone listening who's been to the Bay Area and experienced the deployment in the past few years of autonomous vehicles, more or less very successfully. I mean, this is an example of an autonomous agent. Of course, there's no human in the loop doing any of the steering or the driving. A friend of mine was explaining just the other day that the Waymo he was in piloted the vehicle into a roped off construction zone, and a police car pulled over and wanted to issue a ticket, a driving violation, spoke to him and said, like, I got nothing to do with what happened here. And so, issued the ticket, and who was going to be legally responsible for that? Waymo, of course. And in the domain of AI agents, autonomous agents of the kinds we're discussing here, in certain respects, the liability questions are easier because when there's no human in the loop, we don't have to ask questions about the distinctions between the user of the system. The Air Canada example is a good one. The company was liable to uphold the policy that the agent had promulgated, even if the user of the tool had in some respect prompted the bot to deliver the policy. There's no, as it were, liability that falls upon the user. If you've authorized the agent to do work on your behalf, you're going to be responsible in a moral sense and oftentimes responsible in a legal sense for those actions.
And that is indeed a big difference between what the social media companies to this date are able to defend themselves behind, which is the platform is responsible for itself. We are just the room where the bad things happen in, right? And I think perhaps that's also a good starting point for what Rob and Gopal, you just explained, are issues of how we generate AI governance. And that is an answer I would offer also to your question, Dama, when it comes to liability. I think I like your point about it's basically there needs to be some law, policy, regulation framework, Rob, right? But that can't work. And that's also where you came in, Gopal, without the technical aspects of it and the other way around. And ultimately, and this is where you come in, Paul and Dama, there's entrepreneurs building things within this frame, literally within this room, and they can push in one direction or the other, right? Think about some of the most successful startups that were founded in the last 15 years, including Uber. There were laws and regulation, but Uber very hard pushed against them, and sometimes successfully, sometimes not at all. And in the end, venture capitalists, to an extent, about funding disruption and trying to extend the human possible, right? And sometimes, and this is what we've been seeing working on responsible investing over the last 5 years, exactly as you say, Gopal, and most viciously out of the Silicon Valley context, with a techno-optimist mindset that is losing sight of the human, right? There's lots of technology that we can deploy. We find a problem for it later. Let's build the tech first. Turning this back into concrete things, Paul, Dama, can you give us an example of something where you see agents, and this doesn't have to be in your portfolio, but in the world of concrete entrepreneurs building things, are either doing extremely good work, because I think it's also interesting to see there is an opportunity here to build trustworthy, and actually, Gopal, to your point, where we don't overtrust, but where the trust is actually legitimate, trustworthy systems that are solving problems. Dama, you mentioned a little bit of this in the beginning already, or where, and then we're coming to the role of the VCs in the second step as well, where we've been seeing issues of, we have indeed been over trusting these agents and they haven't been delivering beyond what we've already touched on: child pornography, generative AI, mental health, companion apps, chatbots. Give us a little bit more to work with. Yeah, Paul, Dama, come in.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I think there's an interesting question that I mean, I'd love to hear Rob's take on this, but what I struggle with on this topic is if you think about, for example, go back to a different domain, in the climate world, we have known what to do, what the right thing is to do, right, for decades. And yet we've done kind of the opposite, right? We've solved for short-term gain, for growth, for, business performance. And so when it comes to responsible AI, I kind of scratch my head and think, why do we think we're going to do the right thing? What gives us the confidence to say that we're going to do the right thing this time? And then let's assume that we are. Let's assume the intention is there to do the right thing. There's another question, which is, well, which moral frameworks are we going to adopt, right? Because there's differences. There's going to be, I believe, a sort of a a US moral framework. There'll be a European moral framework. There's going to be an OpenAI framework, a Mistral framework, an Anthropic one, a DeepSeek one. And so it does actually, the reason I'm curious about Rob's things, like it does kind of become a philosophical question. And I'm actually not sure how to resolve that. And that all assumes that you can kind of get the right intent there. Because I think, the only specific examples I can sort of immediately think of are both portfolio companies, but Anthropic and Mistral both deeply care about what they think is doing the right thing. How they're doing that is fundamentally different, right? Very different approaches. But I think that overarching question, to me at least, remains.
Shall I come in here, Johannes? Or okay. I mean, I think those are great questions, Paul. And like, I'll give you at least a little, like one quick reaction is to agree on the one hand that we're going to find that the market, both in terms of nation states, the geopolitical market, as it were, as well as the marketplace of companies, will deliver, moral values. There'll be an answer to the alignment question with different values baked into the models, national approaches as well as corporate approaches. And what that suggests to me is the following. Different companies, different countries will affix gold stars to their websites or public profiles saying, we're doing the responsible thing here. We're not the bad guys. But in a marketplace in which if you don't have any guardrails around a kind of sinking to the lowest common denominator, attaching a gold star to your company or your country is cheap talk in my view. It's maybe an employee retention program, but take the example, I think, of Microsoft that did something interesting. It made a decision early on not to sell its facial recognition technology to police departments or to government agencies that had a policing function. It said, we've decided not to do this because we think the risks of this are too great, even though the technology now permits it fairly easily. And there's no law around it. So we hope that there are some laws passed that clearly define the permissible use cases of real-time facial recognition by anyone in a country. So even though Microsoft refused to sell it on their own, Clearview AI, a rival, was very happy to take the market there. And from a social point of view, where are we? We are like, I can look at Microsoft's executives and say, I admire the stance, but from a social point of view, we're at the lowest common denominator. So I don't feel any particular gratitude to Microsoft. All of this is in the interest of saying governance is the frame for me. If you are a leader in technology, you should be pioneering things that are commonplace standards that you would adhere to and wish to promulgate, rather than gold stars for your company. I'm not impressed by gold stars for your own operation. I'm impressed by the difficult and laborious effort to get standards for the deployment of technologies that we will all use, in addition to law, policy, and regulation, of course.
And yeah, Gopal, come in.
I was just going to come in and to reinforce that point. I think to think that we are in control, or we, the big tech companies are still dictating the conversation, I think is misguided. I think if you look at, and you see it across the piece, many countries, I mean China in particular, lots of companies all over the world now building all these technologies, all these agentic AI, embedding their own values within these systems, embedding their own ethics, what they think should be done. We've seen that with DeepSeek. And when it comes to innovation, I think if we have companies in the US, UK, Europe, building these technologies and seeing these new capabilities come up, advocating for controls over these ahead of time, not waiting for these to hit the market, because others will build the same things, and we will not be ready to govern those systems. I think anticipating those issues ahead of time rather than waiting for them to happen, we're not doing enough of that. And I think tech companies should be mindful of this. there is some of it going on with the AI Safety Institute in the UK. They're trying, but I'm not sure it's looking ahead enough in terms of capabilities and in the right places potentially as well.
Yeah.
I mean, Rob, maybe you will be able to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, if I could add just one thing to that, I mean, like, I think of the safety institutes, the UK has, in certain respects, the most well-funded and most technically capable of any country's safety institute. They're doing really important work, but it's on the kind of back end. The model has been developed and is either about to be deployed or has been deployed, and now we're testing for various national security sensitive concerns or sort of second order concerns. What I have in mind here, and where I think investors play some important role, is go much earlier in the development of the technology, and even much earlier in the development of the technologist, hence the university level. Right now, we have what I would call a massively disproportionate allocation of both financial capital and human capital to pushing the capability frontier forward. We are working really hard on that. How much are we working on the human capital and financial capital allocation to safety and security, to establishing a scientific foundation for the understanding of how these models work? We're barely trying there. There's not much financial or human capital investment to put underneath these incredibly capable models an empirically grounded, scientifically sound understanding of how they work and therefore how to control them. I would want to see from the investment community, as well as from people like, more people like me at universities, building into the orientation of the development of a technologist and understanding that these safety, security, trustworthy concerns can be technical matters of focus, not just regulatory matters. That's the Band-Aid on the back end that we can and should do. But the technical part at the front end is as important, if not more important.
And there's a whole argument to be made, which I think we're only seeing the beginning of, that actually that will pay off. There is two things that we already are seeing the first pieces of where that will be the case. A, there will be a whole swath of solutions that will have to be trustworthy in the sense that Gopal, Rob, you described before, in the corporate world, for governments, because they will not be able to deploy an agent or any kind of AI that they can't see into and they can't see reliability coming out of. And that is actually already coming through when you're looking at the, and I'm not doing any advertising for anyone on this call here, when you're looking at Anthropic versus OpenAI, who they're selling to, right? Anthropic has from the beginning, in my head, I compare this a little bit Uber versus Lyft, right? Uber was always, we are moving fast and breaking things, and Lyft is like, let's build something that actually is legal, works, kind of the same model, but we're a bit better. And Anthropic has been playing this role, I think, smartly in a way that now has led to corporate sales. And unless OpenAI is going to deploy advertisements, which is, in my idea, in the cards for them to basically become a social media company, unless they're building something that actually adheres to these principles that we discussed, their selling to corporate is going to be complicated, right? So there's both a potential market and opportunity, and we had some people at Stanford in the summit, Rob, focusing on from a VC perspective, just funding trustworthy AI systems, secure AI systems, because people will want them, good AI if you want. And even if I haven't done this so far, I think making your AI better as a way of actually selling to corporate customers. Is that an opportunity that you're seeing, something that perhaps also you're hearing in your portfolio, people struggling with, or you're seeing in the ecosystems people struggle with, as there's moving fast and breaking things here, because there's lots at stake? If you're looking at this from a technical, without human capacity only, might actually not work midterm. At the moment, and obviously we've seen the NVIDIA numbers yesterday, at the moment, this is the house of cards, as I like to describe it, still going on. But there is a point that we're already seeing where people are starting to ask too many questions for this to continue. And what is the role of the VC, perhaps both as a corrector, as Rob and Gopal were both pointing at? You are part of this governance thing, right? There'll be a regulation, there'll be entrepreneurs wanting to build certain things, but you kind of, I mean, I call you the kingmakers, right? You are choosing who can and can't even get a chance at building this stuff. Is it an opportunity or a correcting function for you? Yeah, Dama, Paul, come in.
I think a bit of both, right? Because also my cat is just going to jump into the picture. I'm afraid. I'm really sorry. Um, but I think particularly when it comes to AI agents, because there's a precedent here that it will potentially also mean that a lot of concerns around sort of the context windows. So basically, the storage of data that goes beyond the scale that we've seen previously will actually also lead to better sort of laws that are enacted on top. Sorry, that's my cat trying to jump on my door. Will lead to better laws that might go beyond the scope of the GDPR as well. So there's a precedent as to what can happen in order to shape the opportunities that are tackling particular concerns around data privacy. But in terms of whether it's a correction or a possible sort of shaping of a better future, because VC does have a sort of outsized influence on what the future of technology actually looks like. I think there are definitely sort of opportunities to then come back to what actually matters and what sort of common definitions we can clarify in terms of what we actually mean by intelligence, because there's absolutely no consensus when it comes to actually determining what is artificial intelligence, because we have no common definition for what we mean by that. And also potentially just borrowing sort of elements of practices in different contexts as well. So I always think back what it looked like in the sort of humanitarian space, which is the space I worked in previously. And there's a very fundamental principle in all of the work that's being done, which is basically do no harm. So the margin on which we should base our investment decisions on should also take into account what it actually means to invest into AI agents or AI assistants, for lack of a better word, when it comes to the scale and the impact, the net positive impact on people and planet, regardless of whether you're an impact VC or not. And I think that's going to be a decision that's not only driven by investors and LPs, but also fundamentally by founders, because we see a huge emergence of founders who are basically living through some of the complexities of the problems they're trying to solve, or have really close proximity to some of the problems they're trying to solve. And as a result of that, also are absolutely caring about the ways their products and services are being developed with and for people. And I think that extends to the sort of landscape of what it means to understand what tech ethics actually is about, and also understanding the notion that technology is definitely not neutral, and which is why there needs to be sort of the consensus of how do we shape the product development and the growth and the distribution of different technologies as we grow and scale as well. But yeah, that's sort of, I think there is definitely room for correction, but I think the better opportunity for all of us is really to determine what needs to be solved. And that's where capital allocation comes into play.
I mean, on this question, I interestingly feel a little bit more comfortable, because I think built into our model is, we're very simply trying to generate returns for our LPs, and nothing would destroy the returns more than a series of catastrophic events that were caused by a company that we had invested into. So I think there is, at least for us, at a surface, there's this sort of pretty heavy motivation to make sure that the things that we're backing, the companies we're backing, are going to behave what we think of as responsible. We're kind of ending, or I think starting to depart from the kind of Wild West phase of the AI, where people were just throwing money at really smart teams, and I don't think this was as much of a day-to-day consideration. But as we move into kind of more application and solutions, I mean, I know at least for Lightspeed, it's like paramount. It's like one of the top things that we think about, which is what are we building? How do we know it's going to deploy responsibly? Big question marks about what that means. But I think at least it's on top of our mind.
Can I just add to that quickly in terms of, you mentioned the teams, Paul. I think that's one key thing I would suggest investors focus on is the qualities of that team. It's very hard to find tech startups, AI startups that have the necessary skills to understand the implications the real world implications of the technology, right? And the potential responsibility questions that arise there. And what we found is that you do need to have that multidisciplinarity within those teams. Now, there are tools that have been created by the research community and now starting to be adopted by various companies. We call them the responsible research or responsible innovation cards. So give them these cards that help them go through these questions that will help them understand the notions of trustworthiness, notions of responsibility, impact on potential stakeholders, laws that maybe need to be taken into account, et cetera, because very young teams don't usually have all these skills. So they're quite small. They need tools to help them, and there are some tools out there from the research community, but that ability of this team to come together to understand the fundamental technology as well as the long-term implications is quite rare and needs to be teased out. Rob wanted to come in.
Yeah, if I can just hop in there, because I think that little exchange there between Dama and Paul, to my mind, is really illuminating for the audience. The yes, Paul, of course, the responsibility of a venture capitalist is to deliver a return for the investors. But that leaves an infinitely large space of bets to place about which problems technical people can be working on. What are the goals and problem statements? I mean, that's in part and parcel the distinctive thing a VC firm is meant to do, develop a problem statement, a worldview. And I want to just underscore Dama's description about this task, which is what asset allocation in some way is about from the point of view of society, of the globe. Like, what's the social utility of asset allocation in this respect? It's to allocate capital on behalf of problems that are worth trying to solve for, that will deliver some, not merely financial return, but a social return. And so, Paul, what seems to me the distinctive, the glorious aspect of being an investor, as well as the responsibility of being an investor, is the pursuit of, yes, a financial return, but also a social return, by choosing what problems you think are worth working on and putting capital behind the people who are trying to solve those problems. And if you are just an excellent sheep following the herd of the common sense, view about how you can make a buck, count me as not especially impressed. Like, get up and running, the much more distinctive orientation that you have, the privilege been working in venture capital, of also looking for the worthwhile problems to work on that deliver social utility for the globe, in addition to some financial return.
Which is a very good starting point for our last round of interjections from each of you. I want to close, giving each of you a chance again to make us look ahead a little bit on this responsible agents questions for the next 6 to 12 months. You can choose. Paint as I think if we do this, and Rob has given us a vision already, I think we should be building AI governance from the regulation. And obviously many people have been working on this for a long time, and there's regulation coming into place, weakened or not, challenged in court or not, to the industry standard bodies working together on making something that looks better governed. What is your vision for this in order to make this something that both, Paul, to your point, and I always say this to all of the VCs we train, I could not be standing here and telling you to do this if this wasn't aligned with your financial incentives, because I do know you're managing other people's money, including often ours, for financial returns. But I do also agree with Rob, you have an infinite number of choices to make, and some of them come with a lot of money and good outcomes, and some of them come with a lot of money and bad outcomes. And what we've seen in the 2010s is that the second point often didn't play too much of a role. So give us a little bit of an idea of what you're seeing this AI agent space going to do in the next 6 to 12 months, and what you see your role to be in that. And we will close with that. Gopal, do you want to come in first? And then
so I see in the next few months, and in terms of my role in particular, the need for greater clarity around the metrics of evaluation for agentic AI. What does it mean to measure their performance, whether they are going to do something bad to society as a whole, and anticipating some of these potential failure modes and potential network effects they induce. And the other big one for me is dual use. Many systems are designed for, with good intent, with good goals in mind, but can be really easily repurposed to do bad things. And understanding these and anticipating ahead of time, because AI governance regimes and regulations come too late sometimes, and we need to be ahead of the game, and that means working with technologists, companies, academia, and others to really anticipate those risks and build these mitigations way ahead of time.
And I'm going to send all of the VCs and LPs your way to get some expert input on how they should be thinking about some of this, right? Connecting, as Rob was saying, the academic outputs that sometimes, I mean, having been in academia at an ivory tower myself for a while, are a little bit too far away from what then actually matters to Paul and Dama and their entrepreneurs. Paul, Dama, come in.
I think my nugget of wisdom is possibly going to be a bit different, but mostly because there will be an element of like upskilling that a VC will require to do, or is required to do, to also think about, fundamentally sort of build the memory muscle of like, what does it mean to invest into responsible AI or responsible agents, will also require a degree of discomfort and acceptance that we don't always know how to predict the future, which is odd to say as a VC, because we always claim that we do. But my top tip would be just become friends with AI ethicists, follow incredible researchers, scholars on various sort of platforms, dig deeper into some of the amazing work of the likes of Abeba Behane and Karen Howe and many, Sophia Noble, Ruha Benjamin, so many people that we can name who are really translating a lot of the complexities of what we're seeing in the world into very, very easy formats. So also the Mozilla Foundation in general has been doing decades-long work on trustworthy AI. So a lot of the work that we do at BGV is heavily leaning on some of the classifications on what it means to be trustworthy AI or building trustworthy AI as well. There's the Epic Foundation who have written really excellent papers on sort of the harms of generative AI, two different versions of it as well. So there's loads to plug into. So basically, as a VC, do the utmost you can do to really upskill yourself and learn more around how to, make meaningful, impactful decisions.
And if I can add, I mean, briefly, I mean, I guess that my slight counterpoint, if I can, is just look back at, again, going back to the climate, a bunch of us, like myself, had dug deep into climate. I think we let altruism take us too far on that journey of trying to back the right companies and got burned. And actually, I think the goals for climate progression are worse off because of it. So my lesson I've learned and I'm trying to apply to AI is to use responsible AI as a differentiating moat for these companies, as opposed to something that we should do for, like I said, more altruistic reasons. I actually think as we move into more enterprise and public sector adoption of AI, it's going to be a true differentiator for these companies as well. So there's good reason to follow the advice of Dama, and I think it will result in hopefully better outcomes for your companies.
I'll be brief. I think that those reflections are excellent. And, I would point to the fact that one of the comparative advantages or distinctive privileges of venture capital is to be able to take longer time horizon bets. And so while I agree entirely with Gopal that in the short run, something like a much better suite of benchmarks and evaluations, specifically for the age of agentic AI, is a necessary condition, that's an intermediary step in the service of a longer term vision about how agentic AI could not merely create financial value, but of course also social value. So I wouldn't want to get caught up in the short time horizon cycles of thought, but rather in this dawning age of AI agents to have a value proposition about the social importance of it and to pursue that longer time horizon social value proposition. That's where, again, it seems to me asset allocation has a very distinctive and particular role to play. Not merely financial utility, as it were, return, but social return as well. Super important work that's being done there.
And 2 points to end from me, including a pledge from us as an organization. We've actually got a lot of knowledge, unlike social media in 2000, where my understanding, at least today, is we didn't really know what this thing was going to do and where they were going to go. And there were whole new business models and ideas being invented live. And we only retrospectively figured out, oh, some of this we perhaps couldn't have prevented, but we didn't think enough ahead. When it comes to AI, and Gopal made this point very early on, there's lots of people, and Dama mentioned some of them, that have been thinking about what good AI, agentic and otherwise responsible, trustworthy in all the different ways we've discussed today looks like, and what the irresponsibilities are. So actually following many of what you've said today, my suggestion to the LPs in particular with the longest term time horizon, right? And the VCs who would be influenced both by the hopeful evidence and the LP behavior is go and talk to some of these people, as Dama said, and go and read to some of them. And my pledge as an organization is we will help. We'll take some of this stuff. Some of it is highly technical. Some of it is very long and complicated, and turn it into something that actually, as a VC with very, very short time horizons, when it comes to decision making and time spent on learning, and an LP perhaps with a little bit more appetite for that, you can digest. And one way of how we do this for the LPs, as Rob, you know already, you were the entertainment for a bunch of very, very large LPs in Stanford. We will continue doing that. We'll bring explicitly experts in this field, specifically on AI, into the LP conversations, and hopefully make this conversation commonplace. Thank you so much, all four of you, for spending an hour with us today. Very, very glad that we had this conversation, which won't be the last. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.